Entire societies often defend systems that quietly harm large portions of their population. How can an idea survive for centuries even after its moral foundations collapse? Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And before we really get into the details today, I just want to set a quick framework for you, the listener.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea given the subject matter.
Right, because the sources we are unpacking today contain some highly charged political topics. We are going to be examining historical atrocities, deeply embedded legal structures, and even modern cultural divides. So, as your guides for this exploration, we are not here to endorse the political viewpoints of the text.
Exactly. No taking sides, no pointing fingers.
None of that. Our job is strictly to unpack the author's arguments impartially. We are going to present the historical documentation and the specific survey data provided by the author so you can get a clear view of how ideas, incentives, and institutions combine to produce durable patterns of power.
And to do that, this deep dive is going to examine the book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy by Robert P. Jones. We're looking at this as a systems-level analysis of how religious doctrine, colonial law, and national mythology interacted to construct racial hierarchy in the United States.
Which is a massive scope.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because when you're looking at a system this big, sometimes the best way to understand the architecture is to find a moment where it creates a massive contradiction. So I want you to travel back with us to a highly specific, deeply paradoxical moment in 1863. It perfectly illustrates this system in action.
I know exactly the event you're talking about.
It's incredible, right? So picture the Mississippi River. It is May 4th, 1863. Captain Alfred J. Woods is steering the steamboat Northerner up the river, heading toward Fort Snelling in Minnesota.
And the river at that time of year, it's freezing. The spring thaw makes the currents just brutal.
Right, it's dangerous water. And a few miles into this trip, Captain Woods spots something drifting. It's this massive, crude, handmade raft.
And on that raft are 76 African Americans.
Mostly families, right?
Yeah, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. They were led by a man named Robert Hickman. Now, Hickman was an enslaved preacher in Missouri. And crucially, he was a man who had secretly learned to read and write.
Which, in 1863 Missouri, was illegal.
Highly illegal and incredibly dangerous. But because he could read, Hickman had gotten his hands on newspaper accounts of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
Which had just been issued a few months prior.
Exactly. Now, technically, Missouri was a Union border state, so the proclamation didn't legally apply to them yet. They were still considered property under the law. But just knowing that document existed, it gave them the psychological push to risk everything.
So they escape under the cover of darkness. They build this raft with no sails, no oars. They're literally just drifting blindly on the Mississippi.
Just at the total mercy of the river.
And Captain Woods finds them. He sees these freezing children. And he knows Minnesota actually has a labor shortage because of the Civil War, so he makes a very pragmatic choice. He ties their raft to his steamboat and tows them all the way up to St. Paul.
But the reception they get when they arrive in St. Paul,
It's brutal.
it introduces the first major friction point we need to look at. They approach the levee in Lower Town, and the local dock workers, who are mostly recent Irish immigrants, see these self-emancipated black families.
And they don't see refugees.
No, they see an immediate existential threat to their wages. They see economic competition. So a mob forms instantly. They start shouting threats, preparing to violently prevent the raft from landing.
And the police are called in.
Right. The St. Paul police show up, but instead of dispersing the violent mob, they actually side with the dock workers. The police explicitly threaten to arrest the black asylum seekers if they step off the boat.
It's just a perfect illustration of how economic anxiety gets translated into racialized policing. So Captain Woods realizes this isn't going to work. He orders his crew to keep moving further upriver to the military protection of Fort Snelling.
Which is where the paradox really materializes.
Yes, so Hickman and his congregation finally arrive at the fort. They are allowed to step ashore onto free soil. But I want you to visualize what they see the second they step off that boat. Right there near the docks, they are met with the sight of hundreds of disheveled, starving Dakota people sitting in the freezing mud under armed military guard.
The structural contradiction of that exact geographic location is staggering. The Dakota people they were looking at were the survivors of a group of over 1,600 who had been held in a freezing concentration camp over the winter following the Dakota War.
Mostly women and children.
Yes, hundreds had died from starvation and exposure, and the state was just waiting for the river ice to melt so they could execute a mass deportation. They were going to forcibly exile the Dakota from their ancestral homelands to a barren reservation in Nebraska.
And here's where the system overlaps in real time. Captain Woods, the guy who just towed Hickman's group to freedom, immediately gets a new military contract. He is ordered to load 547 Dakota survivors onto the exact same steamboat, like cattle, to take them downriver.
The end of legal bondage for Hickman's group occurs on the exact same dock, on the exact same day, as the final destruction of sovereignty for the Dakota people.
It almost feels like a novelist wrote it to make a heavy-handed point, but it's just strictly the historical record.
It is, and Jones points out the role of the federal executive here to show how the system operates from the top down. Just 5 months prior to this, President Abraham Lincoln was working on 2 historical documents simultaneously.
The Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. He was signing the document to legally free enslaved Black Americans, while at the exact same time reviewing and signing the execution warrants for 38 Dakota men, which remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history.
So how does Jones use this incredibly stark contrast to set up the rest of his analysis?
He uses it to diagnose America's identity crisis. He argues that identity is the engine of our modern political divisions, and history is the battleground. When societies argue about who they are today, they are actually arguing about their origin story.
Because where you start the story dictates who gets centered.
Precisely. If we look at the traditional narrative, it starts in 1776.
Right, the Founding Fathers, political liberty, a general assumption of national innocence.
Then you have the alternative frameworks, like the New York Times' 1619 Project. That narrative argues the true foundational moment was 1619, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. It centers the narrative on slavery and Black Americans.
And Jones points out a structural critique of that, right?
Yeah.
Even though 1619 is an important corrective to the 1776 myth.
He does. He argues that by starting in 1619 in British colonial America, the narrative accidentally masks 16,000 years of prior Indigenous history on the continent. And it completely ignores a full century of violent European settler colonialism by the Spanish and Portuguese that laid the actual groundwork.
So Jones proposes we need to move the starting line all the way back to 1493.
Yes. If you want to understand the actual blueprint of the American system, you have to start with the Doctrine of Discovery.
But I think you, the listener, might be having the same skeptical thought I had when I first read this. Why 1493? The U.S. was founded centuries later by English Protestants, and they really did not like the Catholic Pope. How does a 15th century Catholic decree become the foundation of Protestant American law?
It comes down to the raw utility of the legal framework. In 1493, Christopher Columbus had just returned from his first voyage. Spain and Portugal were immediately scrambling to claim these new territories. To avoid a massive war in Europe over this land, they went to Pope Alexander VI to arbitrate.
And he issues these papal decrees, the bulls.
Specifically Interceptra in 1493, which established the Doctrine of Discovery.
The mechanics of this are just chilling. The Pope essentially draws a vertical line down the globe and splits the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. But the core rule...
The rule that changed history.
Yeah. The rule was that European powers could claim and exploit lands only if they were not previously possessed by a Christian owner.
Think about the systemic implications of that. There were millions of indigenous people with complex civilizations living there. But legally and theologically, the doctrine classified the continent as terra nullius, empty land. Because they weren't Christian, they had no legal sovereignty, no property rights, and no human rights recognized by European law.
And to address the Protestant skepticism, Jones points out that King Henry VII of England adopted this exact same logic just 3 years later in 1496. He sent John Cabot to discover lands of heathens and infidels and to conquer them for the English crown.
Because the utility of the doctrine transcended religious squabbles. It provided the ultimate legal and moral justification for empire.
It's a brilliantly designed incentive architecture in the most brutal way possible. It stopped European powers from destroying each other, and it provided a moral cover for resource extraction. It literally decreed that European civilization was divinely superior.
So conquest wasn't theft. In their minds, it was a moral obligation. They were improving the indigenous peoples by bringing them civilization. Theology, law, and economics were perfectly aligned. Religious legitimacy justified the conquest. The economies boomed from the land and enslaved labor, and the legal system evolved to protect it all.
I really want you to consider how deeply this mindset is embedded in the cultural groundwater of the U.S. Native American scholars like Vine Deloria Jr. have been calling this out since the 1970s.
They've identified it as the core dehumanizing logic.
Right, and Jones calls it the Rosetta Stone for understanding the American worldview. Concepts like manifest destiny or America as a city on a hill. The romanticized pioneer taming the empty wilderness. Jones argues these aren't just innocent slogans. They are direct secular descendants of that 1493 papal decree.
And the transition from religious theology to secular American law is where the system shows its true durability. Jones points us to the founding documents. Look at the 1776 Declaration of Independence. It has that famous line, "All men are created equal."
But literally 30 lines later in the exact same document, they complain about King George inciting domestic insurrections.
Which meant slave rebellions.
Right, and then they explicitly call the Native Americans merciless Indian savages. The exclusion is built into the text.
And the 1789 Constitution embeds it even deeper. We the people strictly meant European men. Article 1, Section 2 excludes Indians not taxed from political representation entirely.
And of course, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Counting enslaved black people as three-fifths of a person wasn't a progressive move toward rights. It was just a mathematical tool to artificially boost the political power of white enslavers in Congress.
The mythology of liberty and the legal text of exclusion were perfectly aligned. But how does a papal decree actually become binding American property law? For that, Jones analyzes an 1823 Supreme Court case called Johnson v. Emmentosh.
This is a huge one.
It is the foundation of federal Indian law. Chief Justice John Marshall had to determine who held the ultimate legal rights to land in the United States. He ruled that indigenous people only had a right of occupancy. They didn't actually own the dirt.
The fee title.
Exactly. Marshall ruled that the absolute title to the soil belonged to the European nations and then the U.S. through the right of discovery and the right of conquest. He explicitly cited the European discovery of the continent as the justification. He wrote into American case law that the tribes were fierce savages whose occupation was incompatible with European civilization.
He just copy-pasted the Pope's logic into American law.
Completely. And Jones details how this wasn't contained to the U.S. This exact legal precedent was exported globally. It became the basis for indigenous land rights in the British colonies of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
Which explains a really wild modern diplomatic anomaly. In 2007, the UN drafted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Out of 147 countries, only 4 initially voted against it. And it was the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Because their entire national property systems are built on the exact doctrine the UN was trying to dismantle.
It's wild. But here is where it gets really interesting, because this isn't ancient history. If you think modern courts retired this logic, Jones points out they haven't. In 1955, the Tehitan Indians case reaffirmed it, stating that the conqueror's will deprived them of land.
And then we get to 2005, City of Cheryl v. Oneida, Indian Nation of New York.
This one shocked me. So the Oneida Nation repurchased some of their historic ancestral land on the open commercial market. And they argued they shouldn't have to pay municipal property taxes on it because it was their original sovereign territory.
And the Supreme Court ruled against them in an 8-1 decision.
Authored by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal icon. And if you look at the very first footnote of her opinion, she explicitly cites the Doctrine of Discovery and the Johnson v. Emmentosh decision to block the United Nations claim.
Which perfectly synthesizes the core theme of the book. Systems built on foundational myths defend those myths automatically. Once the legal framework is established, the original religious justification fades away. Modern judges don't need to consult the Pope, and they don't need to hold personal animus toward indigenous people. The legal framework just operates on its own. It's standard property law.
Right. The system defends itself regardless of the personal politics of the judge.
Precisely. Now, let's shift from the legal texts to the physical landscape. Jones takes the reader on a geographic journey to 3 specific states: Mississippi, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. We are going to impartially report the historical connections he maps out here. Each state has a horrific legacy of violence against African Americans. But Jones asks us to look upstream at the historical tributaries of that violence.
Looking upstream is such a great metaphor for systems analysis.
Yeah.
You realize that downstream events don't just happen in a vacuum.
Let's start with Mississippi. We all know the profound tragedy of Emmett Till in 1955. It's a defining moment of the civil rights movement. But Jones points out that this systemic violence occurred downstream from an earlier violence. Decades prior, the federal government orchestrated the forced removal of the Choctaw people from that exact region.
The Trail of Tears out of Mississippi.
Yes, and why did they do it? To explicitly clear millions of acres of land for white settlement and the expansion of the enslaved cotton economy. The system required the violent removal of one population to exploit another.
We see the same pattern in Minnesota. In 1920, a massive white mob in Duluth lynched 3 black circus workers in the street with total impunity. And Jones asks us to look upstream again.
That culture of normalized violence in Minnesota flows directly from the events we talked about earlier. The mass execution of the Dakota men in 1862 and their total exile from the state. The environment that allowed the Duluth lynching was established by a government that used concentration camps to secure the land decades earlier.
And finally, Oklahoma. In 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre destroyed Black Wall Street. Hundreds murdered, generational wealth wiped out.
And if you look upstream from Tulsa, just miles away geographically, you find the terminus of the Trail of Tears. Oklahoma was Indian Territory, the federal dumping ground for removal policies. And in the 1920s, right around the time of the Tulsa Massacre, the Osage people were facing a reign of terror in that same region.
Let's clarify what happened to the Osage, because the legal mechanism is terrifying. The Osage Nation had communal mineral rights, head rights, to massive oil wealth under their reservation. You couldn't buy or sell a head right, you could only inherit it.
So a system emerged where white Americans became court-appointed guardians of Osage individuals and then systematically murdered them to inherit the oil wealth.
The connections are undeniable.
Treating these as separate, isolated issues obscures the architecture. Jones argues both populations were shaped by the same European settler colonial system. Genocide and exile were the administrative tools to secure the land. Abduction and enslavement were the administrative tools to extract its resources. And both were justified by the Doctrine of Discovery.
And people building the system knew exactly what they were doing. In 1861, Basil Manley Sr., a chaplain to the Confederacy, gave a public prayer thanking God for reserving this unpolluted land for a free government and pure religion. He explicitly linked the Confederacy's mission to the logic of the Doctrine of Discovery.
By calling the land unpolluted before Europeans arrived, he was erasing indigenous people completely. The belief in a divinely mandated racial hierarchy was the conscious foundation of their political project.
It's heavy history. But it brings us to the present moment, to what Jones calls a crisis in perception. We're going to look at some statistical data now to understand how this system defends itself today. And again, as a reminder, we are strictly reporting the survey data the author uses to illustrate structural behavior.
The context for this modern reaction is demographic panic. According to the data, in 2008, 54% of Americans identified as white and Christian. By 2016, it dropped to 47%. By 2022, it was 42%.
So the U.S. moved from a majority white Christian nation to a pluralistic society very quickly.
And when a system's demographic foundation shifts that fast, the superstructure experiences intense friction. Jones highlights a PRRI survey asking Americans if culture has changed for the better or worse since the 1950s.
2/3 of Democrats said it changed for the better. 2/3 of Republicans said it changed for the worse. And among white evangelicals, 74% said it changed for the worse.
Structurally, the 1950s were an era of intense, legally enforced segregation, redlining, restricted GI Bill benefits. But in the mythological memory of those who benefited, it was a golden era. When a historically dominant group feels its influence waning, the system engages defensive mechanisms to protect its narrative.
Like the anti-CRT bills in state legislatures.
Exactly. Jones analyzes these bills using Florida's law as a template. The law stated individuals shouldn't feel discomfort or guilt on account of their race due to history. Structurally, these bills are not about curriculum. They are an attempt to legally mandate an American origin story of innocence.
If you can mandate that racial inequality is only interpreted as individual prejudice, then the deeper structural architecture remains hidden.
Jones points to a PRRI survey on educators. 66% of all Americans trust teachers. But majorities of Republicans and white evangelicals believe teachers are indoctrinating kids to believe America is a racist country. It's a symptom of a worldview defending its foundational myth from the historical record.
This defensive posture often hardens into white Christian nationalism. A 2023 PRRI survey asked Americans to agree or disagree with a core tenet. God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society as an example to the world.
Which is the exact theological claim of the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery, 5 centuries later.
30% of Americans agree with it, but over 50% of Republicans and white evangelicals agree, and the correlations are alarming. Those who agree are 3 times more likely to believe in the Great Replacement theory, 68% versus 21%.
And they are nearly 3 times more likely to support political violence, 26% versus 9%. Jones connects this sociological data to January 6th. If you look at the visual symbols in the crowd, the massive crosses, the Jesus flags, alongside Confederate flags.
Jones compares those modern images to a 1541 painting of Hernando de Soto claiming land for Spain, which hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda.
His argument is that the symbols deployed on January 6th were the ritual implements of the Doctrine of Discovery. The modern system, feeling threatened, unconsciously summoned the symbols designed centuries ago to assert divine dominance.
So how does an institution actually address this? In March 2023, the Vatican officially repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. They acknowledged the harm.
But Jones cites Indigenous scholar Philip B. Arnold, who pointed out a classic institutional self-defense mechanism in the Apology. The Vatican blamed many Christians and secular powers. They failed to admit that the Church itself and its underlying theology were fundamentally wrong from the beginning.
They compartmentalized the blame to protect the system. It's like Alexis de Tocqueville writing Democracy in America in the 1830s.
Tocqueville is a fascinating example. He saw the brutality against indigenous people and enslaved Africans firsthand. He wrote movingly about it. Yet he still concluded that Europeans were inherently superior. He wrote that the European is to the other races what man himself is to the lower animals.
It's cognitive dissonance. You compartmentalize the horror to maintain your foundational belief in your own superiority.
Which perfectly encapsulates the psychological capital required to sustain the system. You isolate the structural violence from your moral identity. But Jones concludes we can no longer pretend that pluralistic democracy and the Doctrine of Discovery are compatible. The U.S. must choose.
What is the crisis in perception here? The crisis arises when societies interpret racial inequality primarily as the product of individual prejudice rather than institutional design. When attention focuses only on personal attitudes, the deeper structural architecture remains obscured. The historical system that linked theology, law, and colonial expansion disappears from view. By tracing these structural origins, the analysis shifts from moral accusation to institutional clarity. The question becomes not simply who believed what, but how ideas, incentives, and institutions combined to produce durable patterns of power. Understanding that architecture reveals how historical narratives shape modern political conflicts, cultural identities, and debates about national memory. Systems built centuries ago continue to influence how societies interpret justice, sovereignty, and belonging.
It forces us to examine the very foundations of the world we inhabit.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
I want to leave you with one final thought to explore on your own. If the Doctrine of Discovery is explicitly cited as the foundational precedent for property rights in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, what would happen if the global legal community successfully forced a modern court to strike it down? If the moral foundation is repudiated by the Pope himself, and the legal foundation is built entirely on that moral premise, who actually owns the land beneath your feet right now?